In this video, we will continue covering Chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More specifically, we will show how to use a query annotation to create JPQL that returns an entity from the database. This code shows the main point of this tutorial. So in our person repository, we will create a method that returns person entity, and we will annotate this method with query annotation, which defines a JPQL select statement that returns person entity and has a single named parameter. In order to call this JPQL, we simply need to call this repository method and provide an input parameter which will be used for a JPQL statement to execute. So the main point of this tutorial is this person repository where this method will be defined, and when the method is called, JPQL query from the annotation will be executed. So this is how our application will look like. We will have a load persons Java object which is used just to enter a test record, because this class implements command line runner, and its run method will be executed as soon as we start our application, and it will load this test record into the database by using the default repository method save. Our application properties file will look like this. It will have properties that configure H2 database, and then properties that configure Hibernate to tell Hibernate to create tables whenever we start our application. So this is how our person entity will look like. It will be very simple with just three properties: ID, name, and age of a person. And my controller will have a single endpoint that simply calls repository method select person that executes JPQL query to find a person entity with this name, and then it returns this person entity and endpoint that returns that person entity, which is displayed in a web browser in the form of a JSON string. We can now test our application by calling following URL, which will return a person entity from the database, and it will display it in a form of a JSON string. So creating JPQL query which returns a person entity is a straightforward, and it is defined by specifying person after the select statement. So in this case, this person was given this name here, but we could have also have something like this. So this person is person string, person variable is customizable. So next, we will show how can we do different types of projections from entity into DTO. So first, we will show how to project entity into DTO class, where entity is returned from JPQL query inside repository. By projection, we mean that we want to retrieve specific entity columns from the database and then store them into DTO that only contains those properties related to those columns. This is known as class-based DTO projection because we are creating DTO class to store projected properties. Entity columns will be returned by JPQL query repository method. Now, in order to do this kind of a projection, we only need to create a person DTO class that only contains person entity properties we are interested in, and it needs to have a constructor to initialize and create that DTO. Then we will call person DTO constructor inside our JPQL query, and inside that call we will use person entity properties we are interested at as input parameters to the constructor. Unfortunately, we need to provide a fully qualified DTO name inside the select statement since Java imports are not used in this case. And as the last point, we need to specify person DTO as a return type of our JPQL query repository method. Now, with this approach, we can't load child projections as we can with interface-based DTO projection. So this is how our application will look like. We will have application properties to initialize H2 database and Hibernate. We will have load persons class that will be executed when we start our application in order to load this a single record which will be used to test for testing. Then we will have a person entity which only has these properties, ID, name and age of the person. And we will also create a DTO, person DTO, that only contains properties that we are interested in. And this DTO needs to have a constructor with those properties because this is what is going to be used by JPQL in order to create an instance of person DTO and return it. Our controller will have a single endpoint that calls repository method return person DTO. So the main focus of this tutorial is this person repository and this single method that returns person DTO by executing this JPQL query that was defined by using this query annotation. Now, this JPQL query will not return an entity as was the case in a previous example, but instead it will return DTO, and we have specified that by referencing a person DTO constructor with this line. So we have to give the fully qualified name path to our person DTO constructor, and then we need to give that constructor properties as input properties we are interested in as input parameters, and then only those properties will be fetched from the database, and we will automatically as a result get our DTO instead of entity. We can now test our application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering URL of our endpoint, which will then return the DTO and display it as a JSON string. In the console, we can see the select statement that was created by Hibernate, and here we can see that only name and age properties were taken from the database, so this approach allows us to reduce the load on the database by preventing Hibernate to fetch all the properties of the entities and to instead only fetch those properties that we are interested in and that were defined in our DTO. So to recap, our person DTO has this additional ID property which was not fetched from the database because inside our DTO we have defined that we are only interested in these two properties, so only these are actually taken from the database. And by specifying person DTO as our return value and using this line to reference its constructor, Hibernate knows that it only needs to fetch following two properties from the database and ignore others.